the brink, the consequences will be devastating for the 800,000 people residing in El Fasher. I repeat, 800,000 people. Recent reported attacks in villages outside El Fasher bear signs of not having military objectives and meaning to cause displacement and fear. Reports indicate that these attacks have been characterized by indiscriminate violence, including sexual violence, looting of personal belongings from houses as well as market areas, razing of residential and commercial structures, rustling of livestock and crop destruction. Fighting is affecting civilians disproportionately, and parties to the conflict, de facto authorities and armed groups continue to levy so-called protection fees and arbitrary taxes on the civilian population. Freedom of movement continues to be constrained. So most people in El Fasher are of African descent. They are Black. Early warning signs indicate that if conflict continues, the risk of racially motivated attacks and killings will increase. The situation in West Darfur points to clear targeting of one part of the population, the Masalit. There are also reports of new Arab refugees leaving the area, which could also indicate ethnically motivated attacks against them. In Sudan today, unequivocally, we find a situation of armed conflict. We observe a record of serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. We witness a weak state structure. We are alarmed day after day about motives and incentives for violence expressed by those who commit it. We are reminded every day of the capacity to commit international crimes. In Sudan, we also witness the absence of effective mitigating factors to the current violence. Enabling circumstances of preparatory action for violence are in front of us for us to see, and triggering factors are as simple as a call to kill. Intergroup tensions or patterns of discrimination against protected groups continue fueling the cycle of violence. We see clear, explicit, and unquestionable signs of an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, protected groups. This is not just a descriptive list of what is happening today in Sudan. This is a list of risk factors and indicators for the crime of genocide. Genocide, the gravest of crimes. Insufficient reaction to Sudan by the global community belittles any progress we've made collectively for the prevention of the gravest of crimes. It is imperative that all possible actions aimed at the protection of innocent civilian populations in El Fasher, as in the entire territory of Sudan, are expedited. It is urgent to stop ethnically motivated violence. Access to humanitarian assistance for population in desperate need is essential. Urgent safe passage is necessary for civilians wishing to flee El Fasher. All possible attention and support for displaced populations in Sudan and in the region is imperative. We know this violence is not new, and in Darfur, the same groups of people were targeted on the basis of their ethnicity 20 years ago. In Chad, I saw the refugee camps they escaped to side by side. One camp 20 years old and the other camp just some months old. The conflict has exacerbated the pre-existing ethnic divisions, encouraging more ethnically, tribally motivated killings, especially in Darfur. So the motives or incentives to attack remain. Hate speech and incitement to violence is prevalent. Violence against women and children is used as a tool of terror. The warring parties maintain their financial capacities to engage in fights rather than in dialogue, allegedly with support from outside the country. The security vacuum has widened, and the warring parties are exploiting it to further advance identity-based mobilization and recruitment campaigns. Decades of engagement aimed at building real and lasting peace and security in Sudan, already challenged by periodic cycles of conflict, have been set back dramatically. So perpetrators of past violence have largely not been held accountable. Impunity for serious violations of international human rights, of genocide and related crimes, or of their incitement constitutes a risk factor for the commission of further crimes. The absence of accountability for genocide and related crimes perpetrated in Darfur 20 years ago is contributing to the current episodes of horror. It therefore remains imperative that accountability for such crimes is ensured. Perpetrators should be brought before competent courts with jurisdiction and held accountable in order to break the cycle of impunity and violence. So as I conclude, it is important that venues for accountability for the crimes being committed at the moment, not only in Darfur, but in the entire territory of Sudan, are identified, promoted, and documented. This includes by supporting the work of those who are documenting what is happening. In my statements, I have asked you, the United Nations Security Council, as well as the African Union and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, to continue considering all available tools within the respective peace and security architectures to urgently protect civilian populations and to create a conducive environment for a peaceful and durable resolution of the conflict, including expediting opportunities for coordinated dialogue and in a concerted manner. Ongoing efforts, also including the League of Arab States, must persevere with the aim of ending the fighting and suffering of the people of Sudan. So we do know that indeed only warring parties can stop the fighting, but the international community remains responsible to take action to protect the Sudanese people from genocide. This Security Council has a special responsibility to consider measures in accordance with the gravity of the situation we are facing. 75 years after the adoption of the 1948 Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the human rights and humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Sudan constitutes a blight on our collective conscience. It also contravenes the very essence of the international obligations to prevent and punish the crime of crimes as enshrined by the Genocide Convention. The protection of civilians in Sudan cannot wait. The risk of genocide exists in Sudan. It is real and it is growing every single day. I once again thank the President of the Security Council, His Excellency Pedro Comisario Afonso. It matters a great deal, Your Excellency, for my mandate and the civilians at risk that you extended the invitation to me to brief the Security Council from the perspective of my mandate. I thank you very much.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Alice Wairim Nderitu, Special Advisor to the Secretary-General on the Prevention of Genocide, for our important briefing. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Joyce Msuya, Assistant Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator.
Thank you, Mr. President. This year, we mark 25 years since the Security Council added the protection of civilians to its agenda. We also mark the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, a cornerstone of international humanitarian law aimed at protecting victims of armed conflict. It is an important moment to reflect on the state of the protection of civilians in armed conflict and to look at action needed to ensure international humanitarian law and the decisions of this Council are upheld and that civilians are safeguarded from harm. Mr. President, it is with regret that I report to you that the situation of civilians in armed conflict in 2023 was resoundingly dire. It was a year in which we saw the horrors of the 7 October attack by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups on Israel, and the intense Israeli military response in Gaza that resulted in death, destruction, and suffering at a pace and scale unprecedented in the recent past. About 75% of Gaza's population has been forcibly displaced. A man-made famine is looming. Thousands of children have been killed and injured in what UNICEF colleagues have called a war on children. An estimated 130 people remain hostage with ongoing concerns for their humane treatment. In April 2023, we saw the eruption of similarly brutal conflict in Sudan, in which tens of thousands of civilians have been killed and injured. Millions of people have been displaced, acute food insecurity has soared, and there have been reports of horrific attacks and inhumane treatment. Conflicts continued to have a grave and lasting impact on civilians in many other places, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, Nigeria, the Sahel, Somalia, Syria, and Ukraine. In total, the United Nations alone recorded more than 33,000 civilian deaths in armed conflict last year, a staggering number, particularly given that the actual figures are likely higher, and a horrific 72% increase compared with the previous year. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas had devastating impacts on civilians across numerous conflicts. In Sudan and Ukraine, for instance, United Nations sources indicate that the use of explosive weapons in populated areas was the leading cause of civilian casualties. Across all conflicts, civilians accounted for 90% of those killed and injured when explosive weapons were used in populated areas. Civilians were also severely affected by widespread damage and destruction to critical infrastructure. This disrupted the provision of electricity, water, and health care to millions of people. Across 21 conflicts, more than 2,300 incidents of violence and other forms of interference against medical workers, facilities, equipment, transport, and patients were recorded. Forced displacement also remained a defining feature of armed conflicts. By mid-year, a record-breaking 110 million people globally were in a situation of displacement due to conflict, persecution, violence, and human rights violations or abuses. 60% were internally displaced. And conflict was the major driver of staggeringly high levels of hunger. Across 19 conflict-affected countries or territories, 117 million people experienced crisis levels of acute food insecurity or higher. In the middle of this, the efforts of the humanitarian community to support and provide for the needs of civilians was severely compromised by widespread constraints on access. Besides active hostilities and logistical challenges, chief among these were the parties' bureaucratic impediments and unconscionable number of attacks harming humanitarian workers. In 14 conflicts in 2023, not counting the occupied Palestinian territory, 91 humanitarian workers were tragically killed, 120 wounded, and 53 abducted. In Gaza alone, UNRWA lost 142 staff members in the violence between October and December. UNDP and WHO lost a staff member each. I want to take this opportunity to extend my sincere condolences to the families and loved ones of all civilians, including humanitarian workers, killed in conflict this year. Mr. President, the harm and suffering caused to civilians in 2023 signals an alarming lack of compliance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law. It also indicates that the Council's protection of civilians resolutions of the last 25 years remain largely unheeded. We must redouble efforts to strengthen compliance by parties to conflict with these obligations. This includes third states taking responsibility for ensuring respect for the rules of war. This entails political dialogue, training, and dissemination of policies, and withholding arms transfers where there is a clear risk that arms will be used to commit serious violations of IHL. And whilst some progress was made in 2023, we must continue to strengthen accountability for violations. This must include upholding the independence and impartiality of the International Criminal Court. Mr. President, as the Secretary-General sets out in his report, the reality is that much of the civilian harm we see in today's conflicts is occurring even when parties claim to be acting in compliance with the law. It is time to complement existing measures by adopting a more holistic approach, one that considers the perspective of civilians and takes into account the complex, cumulative, and long-term nature of the full range of civilian harm in conflict. We have already seen some important waypoints on this journey. The political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas and the 2015 Safe Schools Declaration are both good examples of ways that states can commit to the greater protection of civilians in armed conflict, complementing their compliance with international humanitarian law. We urge all states to endorse these instruments and implement them in full. We urge them to follow the steps taken by some national and regional authorities in developing and adopting proactive protection of civilians' policies, processes, and tools aimed at better understanding and mitigating a broader range of civilian harm. And we need states, parties to conflict, UN actors, international and civil society organizations to reflect on how we can further develop and implement the full protection of civilians approach. Mr. President, 25 years on from when the Security Council first discussed the protection of civilians as an item on its agenda, a lot has been achieved. A culture of protection has taken root and a comprehensive protection framework now exists. Security Council mandated United Nations peace operations have protected and saved countless civilian lives. Security Council resolutions on the protection of medical care in armed conflict and on conflict and hunger have given important focus and urgency to these issues. Yet, in too many conflicts, civilians continue to suffer unacceptable harm. The Security Council and member states must demand and ensure compliance with international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and the Council's resolutions. And if it is to have any real meaning for the millions of civilians affected by conflict, it is time to go above and beyond compliance, to strive for the full protection of civilians against the full range of harms they are suffering on our watch. Thank you.
I thank Our Excellency Ms. Joyce Msuya, Assistant Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, for our important briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Mirjana Spoljaric, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Mr. President, thank you for inviting me to address the Council on this important topic. In 1999, when former ICRC President Cornelius Omaruga briefed this body, he spoke of 20 active conflicts. Today, there are more than 120 conflicts recorded and classified by my organization. Over the past 25 years, and despite the many resolutions adopted by this Council, civilians have been attacked, displaced, violated, wounded, or killed by most reprehensible means. In parallel, there are more and more conflicts where humanitarian action is prevented. Neutral and impartial providers of humanitarian assistance and protection such as the ICRC, are regularly pressured in the pursuit of political or military objectives. What are the means to reverse some of the most devastating trends of today? The Geneva Conventions represent the strongest universal consensus on the need to preserve humanity in war. They are key to maintaining a pathway to peace and stability. The principles enshrined in this fundamental legal framework are independent of culture, religion, or social status. They constitute a common denominator, a shared understanding that humanity is non-derogable and characterized by the equal worth of all human beings. Mr. President, today I want to bring to this Council's attention two issues which are often critical to building trust amongst warring parties: the protection of persons deprived of liberty and those who are at risk of going missing, and secondly, compliance with international humanitarian law. My first point: states must take concrete action to protect all people affected by armed conflicts. Through the Geneva Conventions, states have given the ICRC a unique mandate and specific working modalities that enable it to play an effective monitoring role focused on ensuring that persons detained are treated humanely. Through ICRC's visits with clearly defined modalities and through confidential bilateral dialogue with detaining authorities, we can bring a critical layer of protection in places of detention. However, we remain deeply concerned by the fact that the dehumanization of persons deprived of liberty is so prevalent. Many continue to be subjected to inhumane treatment and torture, poor detention conditions, having their contact with loved ones cut off, or being used as political bargaining chips. When I see our humanitarian access being challenged, our working modalities questioned, and when I read accounts of ill treatment and torture, I must reassert the ICRC's special role and experience to support states to respect the law and preserve humanity in places of detention. And I urgently call on parties to fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law to treat all persons detained humanly and to allow for our principled work. Closely linked to the question of detention is the risk of persons going missing. When people are detained without being registered and prevented from communicating with their families, administrative or enforced disappearances are likely to increase. Large numbers of people are at great risk of disappearing, as human remains are left in the rubble or abandoned in the battlefield, as they are buried in mass graves or left in overcrowded morgues not identified and documented, and as they are taken hostage and used as bargaining chips. I urge the Security Council to recall parties to uphold international humanitarian law and Resolution 2474 to prevent people from going missing in the first place and to clarify the fates of those who have. Amidst hostilities and as an integral part of any plan for reconstruction, states must make certain that human remains are recovered, identified, and returned to their families in a timely and dignified manner. They must ensure that persons detained are systematically accounted for and their families informed. My second point, Mr. President, states must interpret and apply international humanitarian law in a way that genuinely strengthens the protection of civilians on the ground. International humanitarian law is being treated with increased elasticity, in particular, the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution that govern the conduct of hostilities. This creates a dangerous inconsistency. When civilian lives are stripped of their worth, when important norms that protect civilians are implicitly reduced to more optional guidance, when there is no consideration for the cumulative harm caused to civilians by the destruction of critical civilian infrastructure, then we lose the proper balance between the military necessity and the humanitarian imperative. Restraints in the conduct of hostilities and ultimately humanity disappear. International humanitarian law is not a tool to justify death, endless suffering, and devastation. IHL's central purpose to protect life and health and to ensure respect for human beings, even during wars, must be promoted, defended, and upheld. Protecting people affected by armed conflict is first and foremost a matter of compliance with the law. This responsibility lies with political leaders and military strategists, because they have the power to decide on the trajectory of war. Compliance with the law requires resolute policy decisions to prioritize the protection of civilians and other protected persons during armed conflict. Security Council members, in their sovereign roles, in their partnerships and alliances, and as high contracting parties, have a special responsibility to interpret international humanitarian law in a way that genuinely strengthens the protection of civilians on the ground. This requires taking deliberate action in cabinets, in ministries of defense, in training, in the battlefield, and in the public space. Taking a hard look at the situation of civilians and set the protection of civilian lives and health as a central guiding objective in the conduct of hostilities. And ensuring that in the inevitable political transactions that occur between parties, international humanitarian law and humanitarian considerations are not used as bargaining chips. States must collectively and individually use their influence to ensure that humanitarian space is respected and humanitarian action is proactively enabled, that humanitarian access is granted and humanitarian personnel protected at all times. Mr. President, the way forward to any political agreement and long-term stability starts with humanitarian measures, such as the release of prisoners or the return of human remains. As a neutral intermediary, the ICRC can help implement these steps to alleviate the suffering and to build trust between all sides. For the Security Council, negotiating humanitarian access cannot be a substitute for the lack of political decision. Humanitarian relief is a lifeline for millions of civilians, but it will not provide the safety they have a right to and are constantly demanding. States must commit to full compliance with international humanitarian law and to a true collective responsibility for peace that translate into concrete and positive impacts on the ground. People caught in armed conflict need actions, not words. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Mirjana Spoljaric, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, for our important briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Aisha Kadrawi, Executive Director of the Center for Civilians in Conflict. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, Mozambique, for inviting me to address the Security Council at this important open debate. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to address the Security Council on behalf of my organization, CIVIC, as this council marks 25 years since the protection of civilians became a priority on its agenda and on the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. A Yemeni mother told CIVIC, "We have never had any advance or early warnings when fighting erupts, no bunkers, and we live in close proximity to military bases. We know anything may happen, anytime, and we live with this reality and fear on a daily basis." This mother is far from alone in this fear. As wars grow longer and deadlier, civilians are constantly harmed and targeted by armed actors with no safe place to go. President, 25 years ago, the protection of civilians came into being at the UN as a promising tool of the international system to reduce the suffering caused by armed conflict. Yet today, civilians face higher risks than ever. State and non-state armed actors are targeting civilians, violating international humanitarian law with devastating consequences. Civilian casualties are sometimes referred to as the acceptable collateral damage of war. They are killed, displaced, subjected to sexual and gender-based violence and starvation. technology and disinformation are being weaponized to directly cause harm and fuel conflict. I would like to highlight a few worrying trends confronting civilians. Attacks against humanitarian workers. We saw the massive death toll of last year. They become targets, we become targets, or collateral damages. As a result, civilians are denied access to the most basic services, access to food, health, and water. Targeting humanitarian workers is attacking humanity. The use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas. Civilian death caused by explosive weapons increased by 122% last year. States still use cluster munitions despite their well-known devastating effects on civilians. Schools, hospitals, water, and sanitation facilities continue to be targeted, leaving entire areas uninhabitable and driving massive displacement. Privatization of war. States are outsourcing security roles to private military and security companies, in some cases, escaping accountability for harm to civilians. A growing body of research, including ours, links some of these actors to the commission of atrocities, conflict-related sexual violence, and human trafficking. These violations often occur with a tacit acceptance of states. Arms transfers and global military expenditures. Over $2.4 trillion were spent in 2023. States export arms around the world while failing to ensure that those weapons aren't used where there is an overriding risk of the commission of violations of IHL. In doing so, states are creating the very conditions for more conflict and increased civilian harm worldwide. But I believe there is still hope. Courageous civilians and communities are finding ways to survive amidst massive human suffering. Humanitarian workers, peacekeepers, make tremendous sacrifices to protect civilians where they can. Brave national leaders and forward-looking member states are placing protection of civilians at the top of their agendas. Last week, 23 NGOs signed a joint statement that stressed the need to urgently close accountability gaps. We must have the political courage and temerity to defend the protection of civilians as a shared goal. President, on this 25th anniversary, echoing my fellow briefers, I propose 3 concrete actions. First, every member state must endorse and fully implement the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Second, member states must immediately end the supply of weapons to partners where there is an overriding risk of facilitating violations of international humanitarian law. Third, each member state must develop a national protection of civilian policy together with civil society and communities. We need to bring back IHL back to where it belongs, to the people affected by conflict. There is ample reason and opportunity to profoundly alter our approach. The UN Security Council must take the lead in ensuring accountability, fighting impunity, and in avoiding double standards. Reversing the tide of civilian harm in armed conflict is not only a legal and moral responsibility, but is central to maintaining international peace and security and strengthening our world economy. We cannot allow this 25th anniversary to pass without seizing the opportunity to do better. Civilians around the globe are watching us. Their lives depend on our actions today. Let's be accountable. Let's be responsible. We must not let them down. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Hichem Khadraoui, Executive Director of the Center for Civilians in Conflict, for his important statement. Distinguished members of the Council, I will now give the floor to the members of the Security Council. I will start with giving the floor to His Excellency Mr. Thomas Gerber, State Secretary of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président.
President, 75 years ago, following the horrors of the Second World War, the Geneva Conventions were adopted. Our most fervent wish would be that they would never have the opportunity to be applied, declared Max Petitpierre, as President of the Swiss Confederation and of the Diplomatic Conference when these texts were adopted. Today, 75 years later, we can see that this wish has not been fulfilled. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols are therefore more relevant than ever. Switzerland welcomes today's open debate. It represents an opportunity to reaffirm our shared commitment to greater humanity and to recall the obligation we all have to implement international humanitarian law. We thank the Special Advisor to the Secretary-General on the Prevention of Genocide, the Assistant Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs, the President of the ICRC, and the Director of the Centre for Civilians in Conflict, CIVIC, for their briefings, which illustrate the urgency and relevance of our deliberations today. Mr. President, in his latest annual report on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, the Secretary-General draws our attention to a deeply disturbing fact. While armed conflicts around the world are multiplying, international humanitarian law is all too often flouted. Here are just a few examples. Humanitarian access to Gaza is severely hampered, while half the population is suffering from catastrophic hunger and famine is imminent. In Sudan, we observe that the civilian population is targeted and sexual violence is being systematically committed as part of the conflict. In Ukraine, mines and explosive remnants of war have killed and maimed hundreds of civilians, including children. In Myanmar, more than 3 million people have been forced to leave their homes since the start of the conflict. President, these examples do not illustrate the inevitable consequences of armed conflict. On the contrary, they are the avoidable consequences of a lack of political will to respect international humanitarian law. Let us protect civilians by unequivocally calling on all parties to conflicts to strictly respect international humanitarian law everywhere and in all circumstances, even in the absence of reciprocity. Let us protect civilians by demanding rapid, safe and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance, and protecting those committed to the protection of civilians as demanded by the draft resolution proposed by Switzerland, which is currently being negotiated and will soon be open for co-sponsorship. Let us protect civilians by strengthening international humanitarian law through the ratification and implementation of all relevant conventions, in particular the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. Let us protect civilians by ensuring justice for victims of violations of international humanitarian law. Switzerland calls on all states to recognise and support the International Criminal Court. Let us protect civilians by improving the prevention of violations of international law and systematically using the early warning instruments at our disposal, for example, in relation to famine. Mr. President, the Geneva Conventions represent the cornerstone of the normative edifice which we have built, stone by stone, upon the rubble of war, to protect the civilian population and people who are hors de combat. Every one of us, every state, has an obligation not only to respect international humanitarian law, but also to ensure that it is respected, whether within its own territory or by the parties to the conflict. Let us assume our responsibilities. Let us seize the opportunity offered by the various anniversaries linked to the protection of civilians that mark this year to call with a strong, united voice for full respect, without nuance or exception, for international humanitarian law. Because this world is in desperate need of more humanity. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Gurubev for his important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we are grateful to the Mozambique presidency for convening today's open debate. We listened with interest to the briefings of the rapporteurs, the briefers. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the adoption by the UN Security Council of 1265. This placed the protection of civilians at the centre of the focus of the Council. Furthermore, we note and mark the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Geneva Conventions. These are the cornerstone of international humanitarian law. These conventions, the drafting of which saw a significant contribution made by our country, lay out the lessons of the Second World War and to a great extent are written in the blood of the people of the Soviet Union who suffered an unconscionable, brutal crimes being committed by Nazi Germany inter alia with the use of famine to clear people from territory and to seize resources. It is these conventions which laid out the rules of conduct with civilians, including the obligation to ensure that they have basic necessities. Today, famine is being used as a weapon of war in the territory of Gaza, with the support and connivance of a number of delegations here in this chamber. In line with the Secretary-General's report on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, in December last year, 90% of inhabitants of Gaza experienced severe food shortages. Now, the famine in Gaza has been recognized by all. After the Israeli military took over control of the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing point, de facto there's been a cessation of humanitarian assistance. However, the truce that is needed to curb this famine has not come about. In line with the requirements in Security Council Resolution 2728, the relevant requirements, were ignored by Israel, and some members of the Council said that they were non-binding. It is noteworthy that the situation with famine in Gaza in the Secretary-General's report is only on page 5, and there's only one paragraph on it. And the recommendations of the report don't pertain to this paragraph, as if famine in Gaza was just one more episode in many other armed conflicts. We cannot fail to mention that the report mentions the unprecedented level of civilian deaths in Gaza as a result of what has been called, and I quote, the intensive military response by Israel after the Hamas attacks. However, the report continues to make an equivalence, in other words, as if this was a result of deliberate or disproportionate attack, or it could have been the result of legitimate strikes. The deaths of about 200 UN staff in Gaza has no parallel in UN history. Once again, we have the question, is their death being investigated by our organization at all? We asked this when, without any investigation and just based on Israeli accusations, 13 agency staff were fired. The report just doesn't mention this. A one-sided approach is also used in other parts of the report. For some reason, why does it not mention that a part of the territory of Syria is under the occupation of the US, and this occupation is a source of instability and deaths of civilians in the country, whose authorities are taking steps to stabilize the situation? Mr. President, information in the report pertaining to the situation in Ukraine is yet another sad example of double standards. Firstly, Unlike, for example, the description of the situation in Gaza, the Secretary-General is forgetting to point out that the special military operation was started as a response to the years-long shelling of and bombing of Donbass. We're being asked to forget about the thousands of civilians who died, including, at the beginning of 2022, more than 100 children. Second, it is as if there are no daily strikes on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Donbass, Lugansk, Belgorod, and other Russian regions, the strikes which use Western weapons. The West has no compunction about supplying depleted uranium shells, cluster munitions, and mines that are extremely harmful. There are many examples of the use of the American HIMARS system and the British Storm Shadow missile system on civilian targets as a result of the artillery strikes from February 2022. In these areas, in these territories, more than 4,600 civilians have died, including about 200 children, and thousands of people, including 300 children, have been injured. There have been about 100 cases of civilians being blown up, including 9 children, by the banned anti-personnel mines, the PFM Lipestok butterfly mines that the Ukrainian army placed in the ground in Donbass. We have found and deactivated more than 1 million of these mines. The military potential of practically all NATO countries is being used for not for targeted strikes on military facilities, but in densely populated areas and on destroying Russia's civilian population. I'll just give you a few examples of this. On the 29th of December 2023, there were about 300 strikes on civilian objects in the Donetsk People's Republic, the DPR, and damage was caused to a school, a technical college, homes, and infrastructure. On the 30th of December, there was a strike on a civilian object in Belgorod with the use of cluster munitions. About 25 inhabitants died, including 5 children. In the DPR, over that period, there were 12 casualties. From the 31st of December to the 1st of January overnight, the Ukrainian army used an MLRS to shell the Donetsk center. There were 17 civilian casualties. There were a shelling of Belgorod on the 2nd of January. On the 5th of January, there were cluster munitions used on Gorlivka. On the 7th of January, just before Christmas in DPR, the Ukrainian army shelled 15 civilians. On the 15th of February, the Ukrainian army struck residential areas in Belgorod. 7 people died, including a newborn. 19 people were injured, including 4 children. During shelling of the village of Bryansk, a boy died. On the 8th of January in Belgorod was shelled with the use of a rocket launcher Vampire, which is produced in the Czech Republic. Recently, on the 12th of May, the Kiev regime shelled Belgorod with the use of a Tochka U, MLRS, and the Orca, and also Vampire. As a result, over this 5-day period, the entrance to a home was shelled. 15 civilians died and 70 people were injured, including a 6-week-old as well. Mr. President, the report states that an investigation apparently carried out at the moment by the Kiev regime into Alia regarding the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam is ecocide, according to the criminal code. I hope that we're talking about an investigation into the work of the leadership and of the armed forces of the Zelensky regime, who have carried out these crimes, just as we warned the Secretary-General in our 21st of October letter. We trust that there is also going to be an investigation into the supply of the HIMARS system, with whose assistance a dam was destroyed. Once again, I'd like to reiterate that responsibility is not only borne in this case by the Zelensky regime, but also by its Western sponsors, who are continuing to supply long-range missiles to the Kiev clique, and also intelligence, and are sending to Ukraine instructors and mercenaries. Mr. President, in today's armed conflicts, a particular threat is posed by terrorist and extremist groups who are conducting a war without rules. However, in this context, we have to make a difference between armed conflicts where there are terrorists and situations where we're combating terrorism and criminal groups. In this regard, we have a question regarding the inconsistency in terms of qualifying the situation. In the report, for example, in the context of armed conflict, mention is made of Nigeria, Mozambique, Niger, Burkina Faso, and a number of other African countries. However, we're talking here about combating terrorism, but by the same token, little attention is paid in the report to the situation in Haiti. I think we should analyze the role of terrorist and extremist groups in exacerbating and continuing conflicts and inflaming them. The poor attempts of the Western countries, in particular France, to counter terrorism in Africa has actually in fact led to armed conflict. Mr. President, I would like to point out on a positive note that this report does, although in an ambiguous way, focus on the negative impact on unilateral coercive measures on humanitarian action in armed conflict. We believe that this is an important point. It requires further development. Russia has conducted a special meeting of the Area Formula meeting, during which it demonstrated the negative impact of unilateral sanctions on combating terrorism. We believe it's important for its impact on humanitarian work in armed conflict to be given due attention from the UN. This topic should be the subject of a separate report by the Secretary-General under this particular agenda item. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me start by thanking Mozambique for convening this important debate and thank all our briefers today for their powerful presentations. The Secretary-General's latest report on the protection of civilians presents a stark picture. A 72% increase in civilian deaths in armed conflict from 2022 to 2023. 117 million people experiencing conflict-related hunger, and a tenfold increase in persons with disabilities in Ukraine due to conflict. The United Kingdom is also concerned about escalating violence in El Fasher, Sudan, the deaths of civilians in Israel and Gaza, and the shocking levels of conflict-related sexual violence in the Central Sahel and the DRC, among many other grave situations. We should reverse these trends by taking a comprehensive approach to protection. And I wish to make 3 points today. Firstly, warring parties must fully comply with international humanitarian law and uphold their obligations to protect civilians. They must respect the special rights, needs and vulnerabilities of children affected by conflict. We call on states to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. This includes in Sudan, where the UK's atrocity monitoring work investigates attacks against civilians and infrastructure and monitors hate speech and incitement of violence across the country. Second, we urge all states to take practical steps to improve international humanitarian law in its implementation, which in turn will enhance protection. The UK is updating our voluntary report on domestic implementation of IHL with a strong focus on the protection of civilians. We encourage others to undertake similar exercises. Third, the protection of civilians should always be prioritised in peacekeeping missions. The UK is supporting peacekeepers with training on preventing conflict-related sexual violence, and our programming is increasing the participation of women in uniformed roles and helping to address misinformation and disinformation about missions. We call on Member States to deepen their support to peacekeepers to ensure that UN peacekeeping remains an effective tool to protect civilians. President, to conclude, I stress the importance of working to prevent conflict. And I note that in his long list of events in Ukraine, our Russian colleague forgot to mention the fact that this all could have been prevented without the illegal invasion and aggression against Ukraine. We must invest in anticipating the risks, working in partnership with national governments and local organisations to address the drivers of conflict. Progress in this area would go some way to ending the harm facing civilians and communities around the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of La France.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the Special Advisor, the Assistant Secretary-General, and the heads of the ICRC and Civic for their briefings. Sir, this year marks the 25th anniversary of the first resolution of this Council on the protection of civilians and the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. However, the observations of the annual report of the Secretary-General on the protection of civilians are more alarming than ever. More than 33,000 civilians, of whom a majority are women and children, died in conflict areas in 2023, so an increase of 72% as regards the report of the previous year. The civilian harm has extended to several regions of the world, in particular in Israel and Palestine, where we see 70% of the victims. France is alarmed by the increase in number and exacerbation of humanitarian crises at the global scale in Gaza, Ukraine, in Sudan, in Haiti, and in Yemen, and also in Syria. Deliberate attacks against civilian infrastructure, the use of famine as a weapon of war, and also obstacles to the delivery of aid constitute flagrant violations of international humanitarian law. France is extremely concerned by the unprecedented attacks against humanitarian personnel and supports, thus, the draft resolution presented by Switzerland to strengthen their protection. The safety and freedom of movement of these key stakeholders must be guaranteed so that they can carry out their crucial work among civilian populations affected by conflict. We would call for the respect of IHL and for the principles of precaution and proportionality in the use of force. The parties to the conflict must focus on seeking fair and lasting political solutions to bring an end to crises and to their catastrophic impact on civilians. France reaffirms in particular its commitment to a two-state solution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. France firmly condemns the ongoing aggression of Russia against Ukraine. Combating impunity must be a top priority. We would urge all member states to join the call for humanitarian action started by France and Germany in 2019. This was approved by 53 signatory states, but it's crucial to expand this coalition to strengthen our shared action for the protection of civilians. Mr. President, the protection of civilians cannot be a vain hope. It has to require firm resolve from stakeholders to the conflict. It calls for specific action and bolstered international cooperation. France remains determined to play a key role along these lines and calls upon all members of the Security Council to rally to bring an end to the suffering of civilians in areas of conflict. Thank you very much indeed.
The representative of France for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this important open debate. I also thank USG Alison Deretu, ASD Joyce Msuya, and ICRC President Mirjana and Mr. Hekmen Kaduri for their invaluable insights and recommendations. Sierra Leone family reiterates our full and unwavering commitment to the protection of civilians in armed conflict as a fundamental principle of international humanitarian law and human rights law. This year, we celebrate two seminal global milestones: the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions and the 25th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1265. 25 years down the road since SCR 1265, the Security Council has continued to demonstrate its commitment to ensuring the protection of civilians during conflict through various resolutions and other UN Security Council products which condemn harm perpetrated on civilians, including their person, properties, and other infrastructure which support their lives and livelihood, as well as promote the prevention of future harm against civilians and access to humanitarian aid in conflict situations. Regrettably, as armed conflicts continue to escalate across the globe, civilians continue to bear the brunt of an inability to resolve conflict and dispute by peaceful means. In 2023 alone, the number of UN recorded civilian deaths in armed conflict was at least 23,443, representing a 72% increase from 2022. The report of the Secretary General continues to remind us of persistent occurrence of trends and specific patterns of harm against civilians in armed conflict and in specific country situations. The alarming rate of civilian casualties in armed conflict is inexcusable and necessitates an urgent call to action. The Secretary General's report paints a grim picture on the state of the protection of civilians in armed conflict. From widespread civilian harm, the impact of acute urban warfare and use of explosive weapons in populated areas, attack on critical infrastructure, the heavy toll of landmines and explosive remnants of war, to the increasing concerns regarding activities of military, private military and security firms, the imperative to reflect on what it means to protect civilians and to take actions to prevent or mitigate their exposure to harm, particularly in the context of the new agenda for peace, is unquestionable. The widespread civilian harm, as reported by the Secretary General in 2023, was aggravated by forced displacement, including multiple displacement, deprivation of medical care, conflict-driven hunger, famine, and lack of access to water, and the adverse impact on the environment and climate change. We note with deep concern the increasing lack of protection for specific vulnerabilities, that is children, persons with disabilities, journalists, and missing persons. Sexual violence, in particular, conflict-related sexual violence, also remains a most concerning specific vulnerability. The increase by 50% from 2022 of UN-verified cases of CRSV, with a vast majority of incidents targeting women and girls, regrettably indicates the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. There exists double victimizations as victims further suffer from the lack of access to medical and psychosocial support within the prescribed time frame. With respect to peacekeeping, 25 years after the first protection of civilian mandated mission in Sierra Leone, authorized by ICRC 1270, wherein the Security Council, acting under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, authorized the established UN mission in Sierra Leone to, and I quote, afford protection to civilians under imminent threat of physical violence, end of quote. We continue to grapple with not only non-compliance with international humanitarian law and human rights law, but also parties to conflict with the primary responsibility to protect civilians live in immense gap in the face of ultimate untimely termination of peacekeeping missions. Mr. President, in considering the responsibility of host countries, we observe a retreat by some countries hosting peace operations with protection of civilian mandate. In noting the value of ensuring the protection of civilians in peacekeeping mandates established by the Security Council, we must take concerted effort, and we must make concerted effort to ensure effective transfer of responsibilities with progressive, responsible, honorable disengagement, where there are requests for withdrawal or the transition of peacekeeping operations, particularly in situations where there are obvious dire implications for civilians. In noting the imperative to strengthen and enhance the effectiveness of the protection of civilian agenda, we will make the following three observations in the context of peacekeeping and peace support operations. Firstly, peacekeeping missions must function as political tools within the wider context of the conflict resolution processes. They must be established on the basis of valid and reliable analysis of the situations on the ground, and they must equally operate on well-articulated mandates with clear terms of references guiding their operations. The Security Council must authorize missions with the necessary agility, flexibility, and the required resources to respond to rapidly changing dynamics, as is often the case in complex conflict situations involving often very vulnerable civilian populations. 25 years since SCR 1265, we are of the considered view that all peacekeeping missions are to be authorized with a mandate to protect civilians, with the operational managers on the ground guiding the Council and the Secretariat on the types and levels of protection most appropriate in their different contexts. Secondly, we highlight the importance of early engagement with key stakeholders, including host countries, regional organizations, and other interlocutors, from the very early stages of the development and authorization of mandates to deployment and operationalization for peacekeeping missions and peace support operations. From our experience, when SCR 1270 was adopted with the first protection of civilian mandate, its success in addressing the appalling catalogue of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law was largely due to a common understanding and acceptance of the mandate and scope of the operations by the government of Sierra Leone, by the United Nations Security Council, regional interlocutors, and the mission's leadership. The early engagement of key stakeholders can be fundamental in developing that common understanding. Thirdly, and more generally, with a call to strengthen the protection of civilians in the new agenda for peace, we agree there is opportunity at this 25th anniversary of the protection of civilian agenda for deeper reflection on how to address harm to civilians in contemporary armed conflicts, and certainly elaborate a meaningful and holistic approach to protecting civilians in armed conflict. Mr. President, as civilians continue to endure the deadly effects of armed conflict, exacerbated by new and deadlier forms of weaponry and legal non-compliance, this Council should positively consider the Secretary-General's recommendations as contained in his recent report to shape the behavior and actions of state and parties to conflict. There is enough evidence for the Council to be persuaded to act together and galvanize action on a common commitment to protect civilians in all conflict situations. We therefore conclude by calling on parties to conflict to adhere to the principles of international humanitarian law and comply with their legal obligations to protect civilians in armed conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also want to thank Under-Secretary General Nderitu and OCHA Assistant Secretary-General Msuya for their briefing and for detailing the developments of the protection of civilians agenda in the Secretary-General's latest annual report on protection of civilians. I would also like to thank ICRC President Spoljaric and the CSO representative for their briefings today. This Council has been formally addressing protection of civilians in armed conflict as a crucial matter of international peace and security for the past 25 years. Slovenia, as a member of the Security Council in 1999, contributed to the adoption of the Resolution 1265. Protection of civilians is one of our long-standing priorities, and we appreciate that Mozambique is organizing this debate. After 2 decades and a half, protection of civilians is more relevant than ever. Mr. President, the latest Secretary-General report on the protection of civilians, as well as briefings that we heard today, are call for action to reverse a dangerous trend. Armed conflicts are changing and growing in scale. Children, women, older persons, and persons with disabilities are particularly affected. More civilians are being killed. More humanitarian and medical workers helping civilians in conflict are being killed. Other impacts remain multifaceted, profound, and long-term. Latest SG report documents a tragic and grim picture, a 70% increase of civilian deaths, as well as a significant increase of conflict-related sexual violence. The fact that this Council has already met twice this year under the Protection of Civilians agenda item on 2 situations and discussed 2 white notes on food insecurity speaks for itself. 7 out of 10 recorded civilian deaths last year occurred in the occupied Palestinian territories and Israel. Forced displacement, conflict-driven hunger, and denied access to essential goods and services, humanitarian aid and medical care in Gaza are reaching beyond catastrophic levels. After a year of armed conflict, Sudan faces the world's worst displacement crisis and is on the verge of famine, and as we heard today, on the verge of a genocide. The escalating violence around El Fasher has deepened the crisis, trapping people in a cycle of relentless bloodshed, hunger, and a desperate struggle for survival. As the world continues to urbanize, so do armed conflicts, which has devastating consequences for civilian life, infrastructure, services, and cultural property. Targeting and destroying civilian critical infrastructure, as we are witnessing daily in Ukraine, is a violation of international humanitarian law. Landmines and explosive remnants of war hinder hope for a safe return of refugees and post-conflict recovery. We heard this week that Ukraine has become one of the most mine-infested countries, and that it would take decades to make it mine-safe again for civilians. Impact of armed conflicts on freshwater, water-related installations, and water services is leaving millions of civilians without safe water, posing grave humanitarian, developmental, and environmental challenges. More awareness raising is needed, and Slovenia intends to join others in launching a global alliance for spare water from armed conflicts later this week. Mr. President, this year we mark the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Geneva Conventions, the core of international humanitarian law. And yet we are witnessing erosion of respect for international humanitarian law, erosion of protection of civilians, as well as erosion of respect and protection of humanitarian and medical organizations and workers. We should use this anniversary as an opportunity to renew the commitment for full respect and compliance with international humanitarian law. However, our commitment should not be abstract, but rather very concrete. It should not be words, but action, to end with the words of President of the ICRC. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Nderitu, Ms. Msuya, Ms. Spoljaric, and Mr. Kadrawi for their alarming briefings. I would also like to thank Mozambique for convening this annual but yet timely debate. As we commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Protection of Civilians agenda here at the Security Council, as well as the 75th anniversary of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, it is distressing that these significant milestones are not accompanied by an increase in the successful protection of innocent lives worldwide. Mr. President, the latest Secretary-General's report shows a grim picture of civilians in armed conflict. It is alarming that the United Nations recorded over 33,000 civilians' deaths in armed conflict in 2023, 72% increase compared with those in 2022. The current trend of the erosion of the principles of international humanitarian law is nothing but disheartening. Despite these insecure environments, many UN and humanitarian workers and NGOs are striving to protect civilians. Japan pays the utmost tribute to them, and we emphasize that their safety must be ensured as well. Japan calls upon all states to respect and protect humanitarian personnel and United Nations and associated personnel, including those who are recruited locally. In this regard, Japan appreciates Switzerland's leadership in drafting the resolution on the protection of humanitarian and UN personnel. Japan believes it is critical to reaffirm the Council's commitment to international humanitarian law. Respect for IHL is an obligation for all parties to conflicts. It has become increasingly challenging to ensure compliance and accountability under IHL, and many civilians are injured, killed, starved, and forced to live without hope because of the disregard of the rule of law. This is also no excuse for states to ignore the principles of IHL under any circumstance and in anywhere. Mr. President, we must recall that IHL was created in order to preserve the dignity of people, both combatants and civilians. As a strong advocate for human security, as well as women, peace and security, Japan committed to ensure the dignity of all persons, including civilians, especially women and girls in armed conflict. An example of our support in this context is Japan's assistance for mine action. As the Secretary-General's report indicates, landmines, cluster munition, and explosive remnants of war are posing grave danger to civilians, including innocent children. In 2023, Japan provided a total of approximately $67 million in mine assistance distributed across 20 countries over the world through the ICRC, UNMAS, and other international organizations and NGOs. Furthermore, as a co-pen holder of Resolution 2286, Japan emphasizes the importance of protecting medical personnel and facilities and ensuring their safe passage in conflict zones. It underscores the urgency of this issue that over 2,370 incidents of violence and interference involving medical workers and facilities all over the world were recorded last year. Mr. President, in conclusion, Japan is committed to continue to work closely with the UN, international humanitarian organizations, and civil society organizations to contribute to the endeavor of protection of civilians. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for the important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I begin by thanking Mozambique for organizing today's open debate on this topic of great importance. I also thank USG Alice Warimu Nedirtu, ASG Joyce Msuya, ICRC President Mirjana Egar, and Mr. Kadauri for their reality check they have given us this morning, but also for their words of hope. Resolution 1265 constitutes a landmark text in our collective commitment to the protection of civilians in armed conflict. As we commemorate the 25th anniversary of its adoption, we must carefully reflect on the current reality for civilians trapped in conflict around the globe and address the significant challenges we face in the implementation of Resolution 1265 today. President, just as in 1999, civilians are not just victims of war, they are regarded as instruments of war. Across the globe, the starvation, rape, torture, terrorizing, and murder of civilians are still seen as legitimate. Neither sex nor age serves as a defense. Today, just as in 1999, women, children, and the elderly continue to be disproportionately impacted by conflict. Resolution 1265 emerged from one of the darkest periods in recent history, with the international community reeling from the horrors of genocide, like in Rwanda, and severe humanitarian crises, like in Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Angola, and East Timor. Its adoption marked a pivotal moment in our understanding and response to the plight of civilians caught in the crossfires of war. It signaled a commitment to our shared humanity. Regrettably, over the course of the past 25 years, this commitment waned. Despite the development of the vast range of instruments our multilateral system has to offer when it comes to protecting civilians, rarely have they been used in a timely and effective manner. Over the past 25 years, we have seen this in Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, Myanmar, Haiti, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen, just to name a few. Today, this failure continues. In Gaza, thousands of civilians have been killed or injured in the past 6 months. An entire population faces man-made starvation. Nearly all hospitals in Gaza have been systematically dismantled. The scale of human suffering is an affront to everything the United Nations stands for. In Sudan, we are witnessing the largest refugee and internal displacement crisis in the world. Fear of the ethnic cleansings which took place in 2005 appear to be re-emerging, while conflict-induced hunger stalks some 18 million people. The RSF is encircling the city of El Fasher in Darfur, as close to 1 million IDPs face a potential massacre that we must avert. President, while we have deployed robust frameworks and tools since Resolution 1265, the gap between our ideals and the reality on the ground persists. The hard lessons we have learned from past genocides underscores the vital role of accountability. Without it, our resolutions are merely words. It is imperative that the Council utilizes every tool at its disposal to ensure compliance with international laws designed to protect civilians. At the same time, humanitarian solutions will not supplant the critical need for true diplomacy and brave political decision-making. As we reflect on the past 25 years, let us reaffirm our commitment to the principles enshrined in Resolution 1265, ensuring they are more than aspirations but realities for the millions of civilians whose lives depend on our actions. Let us not be passive when confronted with the idea that might is right. In the words of former Secretary-General Kofi Annan in briefing this Council 25 years ago, those who founded the United Nations believed that, despite a bloodied history, humanity was ultimately redeemable. As committed multilateralists, these inspiring words of hope continue to serve as our guiding light. We stand firm in our belief that dialogue and diplomacy hold the key to the challenges we continue to face. Cynicism must never be allowed to prevail. In reaffirming our commitment to Resolution 1265, let us translate our words into actions. In this regard, we commend the work of Switzerland in drafting a new resolution on the protection of civilians and those who assist them in conflict, and hope to see this text finalized and adopted by consensus in the coming days. To conclude, by operating with bravery, justice, and consistency, we can protect the most vulnerable in conflict zones and restore the credibility of this Council in the eyes of the world. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this timely meeting on an issue pertinent to the maintenance of international peace and security. I also thank Under Secretary-General Deritu, Assistant Secretary-General Msuya, ICRC's President, Ms. Spoljaric, and Mr. Kadraoui of Civic for their comprehensive briefs on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. The adoption of Resolution 1265 25 years ago signaled the international community's recognition of and commitment to the protection of civilians during armed conflicts and underscored the necessity of compliance with international humanitarian law, including as codified in the Geneva Conventions. Resolution 1265 has been instrumental in shaping the mandates of peacekeeping missions over the years, and several Council products and other instruments have contributed to a robust framework which treats with various matters concerning the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. Resolutions 2286, 2417, 2474, and 2573 are notable in this regard. However, as evidence in several countries with ongoing armed conflicts, including the DRC, Haiti, Palestine, and Sudan, the road to implementation of this resolution 1265 is fraught with obstacles, including the rise of non-state actors, misinformation and disinformation as a tool of war, and the use of asymmetric warfare tactics. This has resulted in the loss and disruption to millions of civilian lives, especially those of women and children. It is also evident in the destruction of critical infrastructure, displacement, and lack of access to life-saving and essential services. The challenges associated with the provision of some of these services are further exacerbated by the effects of climate change, compounding the already precarious situation in which many civilians find themselves. Mr. President, the lack of implementation of Resolution 1265 could also be attributed to the increasingly relative approach taken by some actors in the interpretation of international humanitarian law, which was designed to maintain the sanctity of life and modulate the conduct of war. The subjective application of IHL is self-serving and deviates from the objective for which this body of law was developed. Let us be reminded that all humans are created equal and must be so treated in the application of the law. When the indiscriminate use of force, targeting of non-combatants, and destruction of essential infrastructure are allowed to take place with impunity in some cases, while accountability is demanded in other cases, it is an affront to the dignity of the human being and perpetuates the dangerous idea that all humans are not created equal. It is therefore important that the interpretation and application of IHL and the principles enshrined therein prioritize the safety and dignity of all civilians. This is critical for reducing or mitigating the impact of armed conflicts on people's well-being. The challenges adumbrated represent a fraction of the obstacles faced in ensuring the protection of civilians in armed conflict. They, however, are not insurmountable, and global efforts must intensify to so do. Mr. President, the protection of humanitarian personnel is also a critical part of the broader framework regarding the protection of civilians. Given the important role that humanitarian personnel play in conflict situations, it is incumbent upon us to guarantee their protection in the execution of their duties. Guyana is therefore supportive of the initiative currently being led by Switzerland to develop a Security Council resolution on the protection of humanitarians. We look forward to a consensus adoption. In closing, the observance of the 25th year of the adoption of Resolution 1265 is an opportune moment for the international community, including UN agencies and other international organizations, to renew their commitment to the full implementation of Resolution 1265. Bearing in mind that thousands of lives are lost to the scourge of war, let us collectively resolve to act to improve the protection of civilians. Further, let us resolve to root our actions in truth, accountability, and adherence to the UN Charter and to international law, including international humanitarian law. While it is true that the protection of civilians is a legal obligation, it is also a moral imperative. The fate of humanity in many parts of the globe hinges on this realization. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank Thank you, President. Protection of civilians in armed conflict is an integral element of my country's foreign policy and one of our priorities as an elected member to the Security Council, as we have demonstrated when the Council has discussed conflict situations. This is why I would like to thank the Presidency of Mozambique for organising this debate and the briefers for their presentations. President, colleagues, the 25th anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 1265 and the upcoming celebration of the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions offer us an opportunity to reflect on the advances in the protection of civilians, but also the challenges. The Council's evolving focus on the protection of civilians, from its initial recognition as a question of peace and security in 1999 to its prioritisation as a central issue on the Council's agenda in 2019, has made it possible to develop thematic and specific actions. As a result, we currently have a robust normative protection framework based on international law and deeply rooted in the work of this Council. The adoption of resolutions condemning attacks on medical facilities which seek to break the vicious cycle between conflict and hunger and which guarantee the protection of critical civilian infrastructure attest to this. Against this backdrop, I would like to reiterate my delegation's support for Switzerland's proposal to bolster the protection of humanitarian workers. The Council has also developed tools to protect civilians, which include protection mandates in peace operations, the designation criteria in sanctions regimes, the processes for monitoring and the presentation of reports, and accountability mechanisms for war crimes. However, this progress should not veil the brutal reality that the world is experiencing ever more conflicts with increasingly devastating consequences for its population. In his report, the Secretary-General qualifies the state of the protection of civilians in 2023 as, I quote, resoundingly grim. This has been the most deadly year in the last 30, and 1 in every 5 children is living in or fleeing from conflict. This reality will not change until we take action to achieve tangible improvements in the protection of civilians. In this context, and in line with the recommendations of the report of the Secretary-General, my delegation underlines 4 elements. Firstly, it is urgent to align normative development with its effective implementation. The Security Council must ensure that member states and the parties to armed conflicts uphold their obligations pursuant to international humanitarian law. This includes allowing and facilitating unhindered access for humanitarian assistance. Secondly, impunity. Perpetrators of crimes against the civilian population must know that they will be held accountable before the law. This is an obligation which is incumbent upon states and, complementary to this, upon international justice mechanisms, and I particularly highlight the role of the International Criminal Court here. Thirdly, the Security Council must establish a consistent vision for the implementation of the protection of civilian mandates, particularly when it comes to the authorizations of peacekeeping operations, and must avoid their fragmentation. Finally, Ecuador supports a vision which centres on prevention and early warning for protection of civilian mandates. This requires the cooperation of military, police and civilian components and adequate financing. President, 25 years ago, on the adoption of Resolution 1265, this Council assumed the commitment to protect civilians in armed conflict. There have been significant achievements, but for many people, this commitment remains unfulfilled. For this reason, I believe that this commitment cannot be simply a dead letter. The assessment that civilian victims are an undesirable but inevitable consequence of conflict must be put to rest. And this will only be possible with firm political will from all governments and respect for international humanitarian law and the support of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. As the chair who led the 2013 POC open debate and requested the Secretary General to regularly report this matter to the Council for the first time, we greatly value today's meeting. I'd also like to appreciate all the briefers for sharing their insights. Over the past 25 years, the Security Council has developed a comprehensive framework for POC norms and translated these into concrete protections on the ground. Notably, this has been achieved by incorporating protection of civilians elements into PKO mandates, and all of the active ones were authorized under Chapter 7. This demonstrates that the Council considers POC a priority for ensuring international peace and security. Despite this, statistics show a grim picture on the ground. The recent Secretary General's report on POC disturbingly revealed that more than 33,000 innocent lives were lost during armed conflicts last year, a 72% increase compared to 2022. In addition, the world is facing the highest number of violent conflicts since World War II, and a quarter of humanity now lives in places affected by such conflicts. As we mark the 25th anniversary of Resolution 1265 and 75 years since the Geneva Conventions, we must bridge the gap between ideals and reality and reinvigorating POC strategy for the next 25 years. I'd like to underline the following points in this regard. First, the Security Council should adopt a strategic approach to POC mandates in PKO missions. Full implementation of comprehensive POC mandates has been challenged by the limited resources of the missions. Finding the correct balance between the two should be at the center of the Council's considerations. The Council's new strategic approach should also tackle emerging POC challenges such as mis- and disinformation and cyber attacks on critical civilian infrastructure, as these impact various aspects of civilian protection. Second, during the closure and drawdown of PKO missions with POC mandates, we must secure the protection of civilians during and after transitions. The Council could support strengthening POC capabilities and the expertise of key stakeholders, including host countries, in this regard. Host countries should also be encouraged to engage with the Peacebuilding Commission, which can assist transitions to strengthen governance, security, and the rule of law, and the prevention of conflicts. In this regard, the Council should work more closely with the Peacebuilding Commission, especially ahead of the Council's consideration of primary responsibility for POC. The Council should also promote national accountability mechanisms, policies, and institutions for the POC, and help national judiciaries hold perpetrators accountable through capacity-building initiatives. Fourth, the Security Council must enhance accountability for perpetrators of POC crimes with a view to deterring violations